Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for today's panel discussion, On the Road to Zion, a panel discussion about Jewish thought in Poland in 1905. Today's program is being presented with support from the Association of Jewish Studies. Before we get started, please note that your video and audio will be off throughout the program. You may send us your questions via the question panel at the lower right. We ask that you keep questions short, and if you could, refrain from comments so we can try to get to all of today's questions. I am delighted to introduce the panel moderator, Professor Avi Patt. Sorry about that. He is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of multiple books on Jewish responses to the Holocaust, including Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, co-editor with Michael Berkowitz of a collected volume of Jewish Displaced Persons entitled We Are Here, New Approaches to the Study of Jewish Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany, and is a contributor to several projects at the USHMM, including Jewish Responses to Persecution, 1938 to 1940. He recently completed a book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and his forthcoming book, Israel and the Holocaust, will be published by Bloomsbury Press as part of its Perspectives on the Holocaust series in 2024. Welcome, Avi, and forgive me for shortening your bio. It's quite long, but I want to get you started on the program.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that warm introduction, and welcome to everyone who is joining us here for the program today. It's a pleasure to have been invited to moderate this discussion of On the Road to Zion. In 1905, Sholem Asch debuted his first full-length play, On the Road to Zion, a symbolist drama about Jewish thought in Poland at the turn of the 20th century. In it, a family gathers from across Europe to say goodbye to their octogenarian grandparents who are moving to Palestine to live out their final years. The family includes the traditionally religious capitalists, Germanophiles, a Zionist, a Socialist Democrat, a secular Yiddishist, a Polish nationalist, and an artist in search of himself. And everyone has a different idea about the future of Jewish life. Perhaps sounds a little bit like the present day and age in which we're living. On the Road to Zion's 1905 Russian language premiere introduced the Russian intelligentsia to the existence of an exciting new literature in Yiddish. Produced by the Grand Dame of Russian theater, Vera Komersarzhevskaya, Caraid will correct me on that, who played the original Nina in Chekhov's The Seagull, it was a sensation. Jacob and Sarah Adler starred in its Yiddish language premiere in New York City. So this is the play that we are gathered to discuss, the new radio play and its translation into English. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce our wonderful panelists for this discussion today. First, the translator and a performer in the play, a writer, performer, translator, and director, Caraid O'Brien has translated 7 plays by Sholem Asch from Yiddish into English. Her debut translation of Sholem Asch's God of Vengeance, quote, set the show world aflame, according to the Village Voice. A 3-time recipient of a new play commission from the Foundation for Jewish Culture, her translation of Sholem Asch's Underworld trilogy is available from White Goat Press. Caraid spent 10 years studying theater with Luba Kadison, the last surviving member of the Vilna troupe, and 5 years studying musical theater history with legendary crooner Seymour Rexite. Presently, Caraid is working on a new play commission for Theater J in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Caraid. Daniel Stein Kokin is a Jewish studies scholar affiliated with Arizona State University. He writes on topics as diverse as medieval and early modern Jewish history, Jewish-Christian relations, and Israeli culture. Recent and upcoming publications include the volume Hebrew Between Christians and Jews and the article Arch Enemy, the Polemic Against Titus in Benjamin of Tudela's Book of Travels. Stein Kokin is also the creator of the academic performance Breach of Protocols, Revisiting Zion's Elders, which interrogates the notorious protocols of the elders of Zion, using them as a springboard for the exploration of Jewish identity in a mostly non-Jewish world. I should also note that Daniel is a recreational shofar blower, and some of the shofar blasts that you can hear in the radio play, I think, are performed by Daniel. Finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Rachel Botchan. Most recently, Rachel performed in Paula Vogel's Decent at the San Francisco Playhouse, earning a Bay Area Theater Critics Award for Best Ensemble. Rachel directed and performed in the world premiere of Die Frauen, The Women, at Theater for New York, for the New City in New York City with New Yiddish Rep. She appeared in over 40 productions with the Drama Desk and Obie Award-winning Pearl Theater Company, including A Taste of Honey, The Winter's Tale, Uncle Vanya, and Away We Go by Terrence McNally, which was a world premiere, as well as Hard Times, Vieux Carré, Toys in the Attic, 12th Night, and Richard III, for which she received the Bayfield Award for Outstanding Shakespeare Performance in NYC as Lady Anne. Also off-Broadway, she has performed often with the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne, most recently in The Sorceress. With Yiddish, she was in God of Vengeance in Yiddish. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel. Great to see all of you here today. So, Caraid, I'd love to start with a first question for you, and then the panelists feel free to jump in. But if you can provide us, this is a really interesting and fascinating radio play that I hope some of the audience have had a chance to listen to a little bit. But I think also the background history of this production is quite interesting. So can you tell us a little bit more about Sholem Asch, where he was in his career at the moment that this play premiered, the history of this production that you translated into English, and also the various audiences for which this show was performed?
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Avi. Like everyone else, I came to Sholem Asch because of God of Vengeance, and I thought that that was his one-hit play. But both of my mentors, Luba Caddison and Seymour Rexide, had met Asch, and Luba had performed in a lot of his plays in the 30s and in Europe and America. So I knew that he had other works out there. And then when I began researching, he'd written over 24 plays. He was the most produced playwright in the Yiddish literary theater. He was a stylist like James Joyce. Sometimes he wrote in verse, sometimes he wrote biblical dramas, sometimes he wrote epic dramas. And then I discovered that the first full-length play that he wrote was On the Road to Zion, and that it was produced in Russian by such a famous actress and company. And how did this yeshiva school dropout who came to Warsaw to become an artist, how did he get to the center of global theater culture? Now, God of Vengeance was produced in Germany for the first time in German at the most important theater there with Max Reinhardt. And now he was also, even before that, there was a play that was just as influential and was produced by such an important Russian theater company. That's what drew me into it, the history. And then once I read it and I saw its connection to Chekhov's The Seagull, which is a play that I really love, and Vera Komisarjevskaya, she had been the original Nina in The Seagull. And then I discovered this character of Justina, which I'm sure the name is no accident there. And instead of asking like Nina in The Seagull, she asks not, am I an actress or am I a seagull? She asks, am I Jewish or am I Polish? It was just one revelation after the other. So I was really excited to apply to for a book center translation fellowship to translate it.
Excellent. And one of the fascinating things about this play, first of all, as you note, that it is his first play, but it really in its production in 1905, or his writing it in 1905, it does capture this pivotal moment in Jewish history. I think a moment that essentially is a crossroads in time where you get a sense of the many different options that are perhaps open to Polish Jews in this moment, where the show sort of represent this in this intergenerational dynamic between the different characters, and especially the grandchildren. So you have the grandparents who are taking this moment sort of from a traditional perspective to journey to Zion, to journey to the land of Israel, to live out their final days in the land of Israel, but from a very sort of traditional religious perspective. But then you can see in the dynamic between the parents and their children and the children and their grandparents, the many different paths that seem open to the next generation at this moment in time. You know, we have obviously the traditional perspective, which is reflected, but we have one grandson who is sort of arguing for a Zionist perspective. We have a grandchild who's arguing for a socialist perspective. We have bourgeois perspectives reflective. We have Yiddishist. We have a sort of rootless diasporic Jewish wanderer who's not sure where to go. So tell us a little bit about how Asch captures the sort of change that is in the air at this time, and this notion of Jews sort of living at a crossroads, how that comes through in the show. And then I'm curious for Daniel and Rachel also, if you can share sort of how you think maybe that resonates in the current moment in which we're living, 120 years later. So go ahead, Caraid, you start.
Yeah, so I feel like the 20th century came out of this play, and not just the Jewish 20th century. And that's why we had the actor who played the Socialist Democrat sound like Bernie Sanders, and the Zionists speak with a Israeli accent. And then, I see the Justina character as like a young intellectual, like a Susan Sontag. And then the artist in search of himself is like a Bob Dylan character. Bob Dylan's biography is named Crossroads. And Zeke Levine, who wrote beautiful music for the play that was original music, he really captured in the music the influence of American folk music and Yiddish folk music. And of course, the connection between Sholem Asch and Bob Dylan is so intense because Sholem Asch's son, Mo Asch, created Folkway Records and recorded so much of American folk music that would have been lost. And that's why Dylan came to New York, because he wanted to be a part of that scene. So because Polish Yiddish life ended up being centered because of wars and so many other reasons in America, all of these questions that this family was dealing with Poland in 1905, we're still unraveling today, I feel.
Daniel, you're muted, but please feel free to go ahead and jump in.
That should be better. Yeah, I was just going to say, in the original title of the play, of course, was Messianic Times, Messianische Zeiten. And I think that very much reflects this notion that comes very much across in the play, that the Jewish world was at this moment where you needed to pick what direction you were going to go in. You couldn't really stay still. One of the characters says at one point in the play, you got to pick a god to Andrzej, who's the aimless, not sure what to do. You got to pick a god and a Messiah. You gotta, there are all these different options. You got to pick one. Even the older generation is heading off to Zion. Decide where you want to go. And I just wanted to say also, just in terms of the Jewish fragmentation that comes across in the play, it reminded me very much of a story from around the same time. Israel Zangwill's 1907 published Zamu Barona, Self-Defense, which actually is set in the context of a small Polish town threatened with a pogrom. And this young activist, David Ben Amram, shows up to try to unite and organize the Jews in self-defense. And in Zangwill's description, it proved impossible because there was such a bristling of sects and pullulating factions, each with its councils, federations, funds, conferences, party days. It was impossible to unite the Jews of this town to defend themselves because everyone, they were pulled already in so many different directions, as are the characters in this play.
Rachel, I'm curious, when you perform in a show like this, what are the resonances that you see from 120 years ago to the present moment?
Yeah, well, one thing that I was really taken with the play, reading it and then also listening to it and performing the various roles. I played two roles. I played Bertha, the German daughter. Well, she's not German. She married a German, and she comes back from Germany. And then Queen Esther at the end of the Polish, I guess, sort of ghost at the end. But is the portrayal of women. And, I know Sholem Asch from God of Vengeance has such compassion and for women and a real seeming understanding of them. And I felt that it really portrayed different kinds of women. So, you know, for example, Bertha was this kind of subservient wife, was very proud of her husband, but maybe kept down a bit. Then Justina is the scholar. Then you have Esther, who was taken advantage of and just searching. And so this also this feeling of searching in the play feels very universal to me, and that you know, that we're all searching for meaning. And yeah,
no, it raises some really interesting questions about identity. Obviously, I mean, we're talking about identity and politics and choices and sort of Jewish paths for the future, but that are very much connected to the past. I mean, I think one of the things that's fascinating about the play is that, you know, we have a sort of an association with Poland that is, of course, influenced by memory of the Holocaust, but if we think about this moment in 1905 that Asch is writing the play in, you can see this tension, especially with I think the Esther character, which is very much sort of this connection to Jewish roots in Poland, like ancient Jewish roots in Poland. You know, this mythology of the idea that there was a mythological Esther who you know, was connected with the Polish king, who interceded on behalf of the Jews and saved the Polish Jews and helped them. And it sort of goes back to like Jewish roots all the way back in Poland. But at the same time, there is this choice that the next generation has to face, right? That, you know, do they stay in Poland? And some of the characters voice this idea of, yes, you know, this is the mother that has nurtured us. This is, of course, we're going to stay. And then there are those who say, no, we have to leave, right? We have to build a new future. So it does capture this tension between rootedness in Poland, a connection to Poland, or, you know, giving up on that dream and moving forward. And I think it does resonate a lot with the present moment that we're living in certain ways. I don't know, Caraid, if you want to say more about sort of what captured you in terms of the significance of the politics and how it does resonate with the present moment.
Yeah, I think that we forget how Polish these Jewish characters are. And we forget that Sholem Asch is as much a Polish writer as he is a Jewish writer or a Yiddish writer. And just imagine if we were faced, you know, American Jews were faced with having to choose, are we American, are we Jewish, you know, and just the outrage of the Justina character that people would question her Polishness and her commitment to the land. And then she even says, you know, as soon as to her grandfather, the moment the first Pole walked the earth, there was a Jew there with a pack in his hand, and she does the image of kind of the wandering peddler. And we just, you know, we think, who gets to escape? But what about all the people who didn't want to escape? And at these fateful crossroads of history, where a decision of what you believe in will impact whether you live or die. So that's very high dramatic stakes that turned out, that worked for a play, of course, and turned out to actually be real life stakes. And so I was just very moved by how Polish some of the characters felt that they were, and just the outrage that could be taken away. And then the grandfather, Reb Chonin, you know, as Andre, the young Bob Dylan character, is like, I want to believe in something. I know I have something inside me to say, I just don't know what to believe in. And the grandfather says to him, have faith. And that's also in Chekhov's The Seagull, you know, the characters, the artist who can't believe in himself, doesn't have faith in himself, doesn't have faith in his art, is the one that ends up committing suicide. So this whole idea that we have to have faith, and what I thought was so exciting about Asch and the viewpoints that he was presenting was that the Zionist, the Social Democrats, the Bernie Sanders viewpoint of Jewish life is just as Jewish as the traditionally religious. So he was really saying right then, which I think must have been a radical viewpoint that a lot of people didn't share, that you can be Jewish in all of these different ways. And that's an exciting conversation, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if I could jump in,
Daniel, go ahead, and then Rachel, you can
I'll
follow
try
up.
to be
Yeah.
quick. Yeah, just on a few of those points. I mean, I'm really struck by the language, the imagery of rootedness. And I love this one passage where Hanan, the grandfather figure, says, "We had our roots planted in the wind," which I think just captures so nicely, I mean, his whole notion of really living by faith and being sustained by faith. On the question of, I want to though just also refer back to the last thing Caraid said about Asch's notion that you can be Jewish and yet go in all of these different directions. I do think that he's really, I don't entirely disagree, but I do think that he's at least exploring to what degree that's true. I mean, there is the grandfather does say, you know, you have transformed our great God into tiny little gods. And while I'm not saying that the grandfather necessarily speaks for Sholem Asch there, I can't help but I felt that Asch had a certain sympathy to that view as he was expressed. I feel like Asch is actually posing the question, certainly all these different movements, they come from a Jewish impulse, but wondering nonetheless, at what point do they perhaps stray too much from that? But then again, there's also the grandfather who has this notion that actually it's the sum of all of our different ideologies and different tendencies that in a sense amounts to Jewishness. So perhaps even the grandfather as a character is sort of trying to figure this out a little bit. So again, I don't disagree. I just wanted to complicate that notion a little bit in Asch.
Rachel, please.
Oh, yes. I just wanted to add more about the production element of it, which was that I found it really fascinating listening to it because we are talking about all these different voices and there's so many different voices represented, and somehow listening to it in an audio way as opposed to seeing it visually as you perhaps would on the stage or screen made you hear those voices more. And that's also a testament to Caraid because all of them are so distinct, both in the writing and in the performing of them. I really was able to follow all of the arguments and all of the voices. And I mean, Caraid touched upon like with accents and things, but it's not just that. It's also in the listening, the active listening, and the way that it comes through in the audio. I thought that was really fascinating and added something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is I'm glad you brought that up, because for those who maybe have not listened to it yet, and you're watching this, I hope you will go now listen to the radio play. And I think that does add a great deal in terms of hearing the voices of these different characters and the significance of they all have something to say that seems to be given equal weight by Asch, right? And I think that's an important thing. It doesn't feel like he's tipping the scales, although correct me if you disagree, it doesn't feel like he's tipping the scales. He's trying to sort of present the diverse possibilities that exist for Polish Jews at the time at a crossroads, and kind of all of these different characters are giving voice to it. And I agree, I think that's an excellent point, Rachel, that when you listen to it as a radio play, for those of us who might recall sort of those older radio plays, and maybe this is the moment where we're starting to see sort of a return to this type of audio production where we'll see more of this. It does emphasize the significance of each of those voices. I know, Caraid, maybe tell us a little bit about sort of the idea of creating a radio play as opposed to sort of stage production, how that came about.
Yeah, I just want to say just a quick comment to your last point was I think that he's toughest on the parents' generation, the capitalists, the merchants. You know, when the father of Andre and Justina says, "What do you about his brother's children? What do they think they're going to do? Save the world?" You know, and is kind of mocking about that. And then that sad scene at the end when he's like, "I'd like to go with you to Zion, but I can't. All my money is here in Goyish hands. I have to stay with that. I can't give up the stuff that I've built." And then the grandfather's like, "Forget about it. Save your soul, save your soul." But they can't do it. And but so your question was why a radio play? Well, it was kind of a pandemic thing. You know, I have a long background in radio. I did Ulysses Bloomsdays on the radio for many years and did some programming in WBAI. But during the pandemic, Lisa called me up and said, "Hey, can you put together something for the Carnegie Hall's Voices of Hope Festival?" And it was just when people started started getting vaccines. And so I said, well, I could wear a mask and I could bring the actors in one by one and record them. And so that was the first Sholem Asch radio play, The Dead Man, which is also on the Yiddish Book Center site and is about the end of World War I during the flu epidemic, where people don't even know who is alive and who is dead. Things are so bad. So it started with that, and that was such a big success that I wanted to do it again. And I record people in my apartment, and I still record the actors one by one, which is kind of crazy and labor intensive, but it's really addictive. And, you know, working with actors like Rachel, you're going to get 3 great takes from them, and, you know, listening to them all and picking the right one. And then it's also about the breath and which lines overlap and where is their space. And sometimes, like for me, a translation is for theater. A translation is never finished. It shouldn't be published until the actors have worked on it, until it's been on a stage of some sort. And it's so hard to put on theater now, especially in pandemic times, that it was exciting to discover that the radio play did that work for me. You know, every actor fixed a line in the translation, and some people added lines. Michal Yashinsky was good about adding lines, and Zeke added a swear word once. He's like, this needs a swear word here, and I said, all right, do it. And it worked because the actors made it work, and so that's a really important part of the translation process for me, I think.
Rachel, what was it like from your perspective in terms of sort of, you know, performing a radio play, but doing it by yourself individually? I take it that everybody recorded their lines, and then Caraid, you mixed everything together. So tell us sort of how you approached it, Rachel, in terms of your different parts.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like a mystery how it's all going to come together, which is part of the exciting part, to listen to it at the end. But I did The Dead Man with Caraid also, and I also do a lot of audiobooks. So for me, this milieu, this genre is kind of familiar, the recording, and I love it. It is, you know, you do have to try it many different ways because you don't have the same interaction with the other actor that you would if they were right there in the room with you. So that's the challenging part, is imagining their response. And then, you know, and that's why we do so many different takes, I think, because then Caraid can take, oh, well, this sounds like the way you would respond to the way Alan said this line, if that makes sense. So it's just kind of experimenting with lots of different ways of saying the same line, which is really fun.
And I just want to jump in to say that when Rachel did Esterka at the end, you know, I have lots of props in my house, and she had a long stick in her hand, and, you know, she was, I am Esterka, you know, it just kind of, boom, it was beautiful to watch her do that performance and to bring to life, just like it happens in this play, this medieval ghost of a Jewish figure that may or may not have existed. There's different viewpoints on that, but she exists in both Yiddish and Polish sources.
Yeah, that was fun to have a prop, because one doesn't usually have that in a recording studio. That was great. Good idea.
Nice. Daniel, you wanted to jump in, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, you have to have faith, though, evoking our earlier discussion in this kind of production when you're reciting your lines. Sorry, that's all I was going to say.
Yes.
Right. So I want to return to something that came up before, but that is intriguing about the history of this production, which is the Sholem Asch original production, which I don't think we mentioned, but that he writes it originally in Yiddish, but then it is not originally performed in Yiddish, and it is originally performed in Russian and then in Polish, if I'm not mistaken, and then sort of catches the attention of the Yiddish theater world. So it's quite interesting then for us to reflect on sort of the process of translation, which is beginning almost immediately with the history of this play, but then also, you know, the sort of the question of audience and what do different audiences take away from hearing a play like this. So Caraid, maybe you can start. I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about that background history of the production, and then also what maybe that says about the Jewish world and the Jewish theater going world at the time and the world of Yiddish theater at the time, that it wasn't originally performed in Yiddish, that he couldn't get it staged. And so it's originally in Russian. Like, what does that tell us about what's going on in the Jewish world?
Yeah, well, at this time in his career, he was in his early 20s. His short stories were being edited and approved of by Yudlamet Peretz and making their way into magazines and newspapers. And he had written some one-act plays. But he wanted to go deep into the center of where the action was happening artistically, and Warsaw was full of, as well as Jewish artists, Christian artists, and he was hanging out with experimental painters as well as actors and directors. And the original title of the play, Mashiach Zeiten, a Cholem von mein Volk, in the time of the Messiah, a dream of my people. I mean, that's a very Jewish title. And Sholem Asch, throughout his career, which would get him into a lot of trouble in the late 30s and 40s, he's obsessed with the idea of Jewish messiahs and with the world's obsession with Jewish messiahs, whether it's Jesus or Shabtai Tzvi. And here he is talking about, what is a messiah? What does this mean, this messianic belief that there is something, a belief that can save us and rescue us. And so Vera Komisarjevskaya's company was experimental. It had the influential director Alexander Meyerhold in it, who was a symbolist director. So Asch was obviously influenced by him. And she chose the title, I'm not saying, I don't speak Russian, like Nuputi Zion. So On the Road to Zion. So that's the title I took as an homage to the first production of it. And also because as an homage to this idea of, on the road being, a whole 20th century that has big resonance in American culture as well. And even though Asch didn't know it at the time, all of these ideas that he was writing about here would be hugely influential in American Jewish art and in just American art as well, and life. So the Russian intelligentsia, this was the first time that they'd seen a play by a Yiddish author. And it was the first time that they realized, oh, wow, there's some really brilliant, intellectual, exciting, cutting edge stuff happening in Yiddish, and which they had just had stereotypes of just small shtetls and not great intellectual artistic forces there. So that was the big moment. And that's what got it translated into Polish. And Asch made money on this, and he made enough money to go to travel around and see other plays, which led him to Germany, which led him to see a production of Rudolf Schildkreuth in Shylock's Merchant of Venice, and say, oh, I want to write a play like that. And that's why he wrote The Brothel Owner, God of Vengeance for him. And of course, Rudolf Schildkreuth is the father of the Academy Award-winning author Joseph Schildkreuth. So all of these great artistic figures are somehow being influenced by Yiddish life, by global life, and ending up in America and creating the 20th century in a way. And this is what drew me to learning Yiddish and studying Yiddish, because I just felt it was this powerful force defining art in America in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think that one thing that struck me about the style of the piece, and I think this is what Caraid is speaking to, is it's not, a kitchen sink drama or even a traditional classical play. It's really, as I think you said, cutting edge, and it's not linear really, and it feels experimental and modern. Yeah.
I was just curious, do we know why the Yiddish theaters weren't interested, given that Asch already had a reputation at the time? What was it about?
Well, he didn't have a reputation as a playwright, really. His one acts weren't big moments in the Yiddish theater at that time. And, they just didn't, if they felt it maybe didn't have enough, I don't know exactly why, but I'm guessing that maybe it was just too different from the other plays that were happening. Jacob Gordon was the top playwright at the moment, and he was kind of doing like Sappho and the Yiddish Queen Lear and doing that sort of thing. But there's an element of Lear in this, the patriarch and the children going off in different ways. And there's an element of Hamlet in the indecision of Andre. And so, it didn't take them long to figure it out. He wrote it in 1905. It was produced in 1906, first in Russian, and then we're talking a couple of months. then Polish a couple of months later, and it opened the season in New York of Jacob Adler's theater, and he played Reb Chonin, and his wife Sarah Adler played Justina.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? To learn a little bit about the background history of the reception, and also the ways in which, when it's perceived and seen to be cutting edge and avant-garde sort of in Russian circles, then it makes its way back into its original Yiddish audience. But also, to think about the ways in which this production would then be interpreted and received in different ways by the different audience for which it is performed, right? Because on the one hand, it is a very Jewish show. I mean, Mashiach Zeit, it's Road to Zion, however we translate it, it's a very, very Jewish show. And yet, we're thinking about sort of how it's then going to be performed and translated for other audiences. It's interesting. We were talking about all the different identities that are laid out in the play, and the different paths. And I think it's worth noting that Sholem Asch is essentially articulating a path on his own, right? This sort of Yiddishist or Yiddish theatrical path. Can you say a bit more about sort of both what that represented in the early 20th century, and then I'm curious from all of your perspectives as both actors and writers and scholars who've been involved with the Yiddish Book Center and the world of Yiddish today, kind of perhaps how that this play also reflects sort of a different path, perhaps a Yiddishist path, going into the 21st century, what that means.
I love that
Go ahead,
question.
Caraid, start.
Because as the social democrat, Chaim, played by Shahar Feinberg, who did the final mix of the play. I want to give him a little shout out there. He's a wonderful audio engineer as well.
The Bernie Sanders voice, right?
Yes, the Bernie Sanders voice. He's Israeli actually, but he did a great Bernie Sanders, and is the Michal Yashinsky, who played Moshe, the young Yiddishist. To me, that's a young Aaron Lansky or a young Uriel Weinreich. We forget that Yiddish had to, the secular artistic explosion, that it had to fight for it had to be created by the people who loved the language and had the artistic know-how or just God-given gifts to create it. And yes, Yiddish became the world that Sholem Asch wrote in, and not in Hebrew. And even though he had connections to Israel, he wrote in Yiddish his whole life. But he was so key as both a playwright and a novelist, because he always was positioning the language in a global context through translation or being influenced by authors who weren't Jewish, and by dialoguing directly with, why are all you Christians obsessed with this Jewish rabbi named Jesus? So he was always trying to make these connections that went outside the Yiddish community. And a few years after this, and the play after play, Matkaganov was a big success, and Our Faith was a big success. He was lionized, and then later he was exiled from the Yiddish community, so for his Christological novels. So it's he's such an important figure, and he's such a fearless figure in the creation of Yiddish, of letters, and he's so much so that he was willing to confront it and follow his artistic impulses no matter where it led him.
Yeah, such an interesting figure. Daniel and Rachel, I'm wondering, I'd love to hear your thoughts about sort of the world of Yiddish, Yiddish theater, Yiddish literature, the past, present, and perhaps future. What a work like this suggests about alternative paths or different paths, for the future of Yiddish and a Yiddishist identity.
Want to go first, Daniel?
Go ahead.
No, you can go.
Well, I don't know that I have to think that over a little bit, but I would just say, I mean, when I listened to this play, I mean, of course, I was imagining, what would it look like to rewrite this play for our own time. And I think it actually would be sort of a fun experiment to try to do that, actually, and perhaps even as a Yiddish play, to try to try to, in a sense, bring out something of the spirit, of the sense of crisis, of the sense of needing to stake out, again, to pick your Messiah, to pick your God in the early 20th century, and to reimagine that, to resituate that in the early 21st century. Just want to say, I'm really struck by the character of Andrzej in this play for several reasons. One, I mean, this is the indecisive figure whose name, by the way, he's Anshel in Yiddish or Andrzej in Polish. Anshel is of course Yiddish for Asher, so happiness, happy. Andrzej comes from a Greek word meaning manliness, and he's anything but both of those things. And it's sort of, in a way, I sort of felt like, well, his indecisiveness, in a sense, maybe he is the sort of the most honest of the figures, in the sense that he really isn't. He's really sort of willing to admit that he isn't really sure what direction he should go in at a time where, again, people feel compelled to pick out a direction which they want to go. And I found it interesting that Asch sets him as a student in Bern in Switzerland. He seems like he's taken on something of the Swiss identity, in a sense. He describes himself as at the border between countries, between people, between languages, and that's where did he get this? So it's sort of perfect in the sense that Asch puts him where he does. And of course, he is the very last voice of the play, which I think really raises a very interesting question. I mean, just in the minutes before, we have this mass exodus with the grandparents and others heading off to Zion or wherever exactly they're going. But then at the very end of the play, we have him again, sort of indicating, well, I don't know, where am I? Who am I? Where should I go? What should I be? Is that Asch, in a sense, perhaps, grappling with these questions? And it seems to me that in our own day, you could very much end the play with a character in very much the same place. Except today we might call the play not on the road to Zion, the road to nowhere, perhaps. It sometimes feels like.
Well, yeah. I'm always fascinated to think about how these plays were originally produced, and just to imagine in my mind the actual production. And then I would love to see a production of the actual Yiddish or a translation in English. Yes, adaptations and modern adaptations are wonderful, but I also think there's a place for bringing these works of literature as they are written to our modern times. And the language is so beautiful. There's such poetry in the translation, and I haven't read the Yiddish, but I'm sure in the Yiddish, and that I feel that to me, that's what I strive for in my work, and what I would love to see for the future of Yiddish theater, along with the new adaptations and the new plays and all of that. But it's tricky because these plays have like 1 million characters, so it's hard to ever produce them. But yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, we just need a few million.
Yeah.
Okay, we've heard it here now. That's all we need in order to produce a timeless classic. No, but to that point, I mean, I think I personally would love to see this sort of performed on the stage. Not to take anything away from the brilliance of creating it as a radio play, which, as we've suggested, works in all sorts of really interesting and different ways for us to hear the voices. But yeah, it would be, really fascinating to imagine sort of how this would be produced for the present moment, and what the characters might be thinking about in America in the year, let's say 2025. And it works. I think it would work in that way, in terms of, which does suggest sort of the timeless nature of the questions that Asch is raising. I know that soon we're going to transition to Q&A from audience questions that have come in, but I'll just ask one other question before we transition to that segment. Caraid, I'm curious. So Rachel alluded to like translating it from the original Yiddish into English. Can you tell us a little bit more? There must be certain complex decisions that you have to make in terms of, I'm thinking linguistically, because we have different characters who represent different identities, who must some of them sort of use a little bit more German when they speak, and some use a little bit more Polish when they speak, and some use a little more Loshin Kodesh when they speak? Like, how do you sort of, as a translator, convey the complexities, the nuances of the Yiddish that would come through in the Yiddish original, but might get lost in the English? How do you convey that into the English?
Well, yeah, Sholem Asch is great about creating a distinct vocabulary for each of his characters that is almost like a biography of where they lived in the world or how religious they are. His religious characters would speak more Hebrew and so on. And so he had a lot of German words, ja, Fräulein, and that's written in Yiddish. We ad-libbed a few when we were making fun of the Zionist of Ben Zion. There was a few modern Hebrew words that we threw in that weren't in there, but the character comes in and he says, Shalom Elma, so that's the original. And I left that in exactly as it is because it's so awkward and wonderful. And just how much that you can tell. And this is also why I love working with Jewish literature, just from how someone says shalom, or how someone says Shabbat, or Shabbos, or Sabbath. It just tells you so much about a character, just how they pronounce one word. And I love to leave a little bit of Yiddish in there when I can and when it works. And Michal Yashinsky, who appropriately played the Yiddishist, was endlessly ad-libbing, Yiddish back into the translation, and I loved that. And so it's a dense text. The poetry is Asch. I didn't make it more poetic. Justina is as poetic as she's written. He's a very poetic writer. The intellectual conversations, that took me some time to unwind and then, put it in a way that seemed like a conversation that Daniel and I might have had at the Yiddish Book Center summer program in 1994 when we were both interns. Like, well, what do you believe in? What do you think about this? And I really wanted to get this idea of college students getting together and, being disappointed with their parents' way of life, being terrified by the bleak future that stretched out in front of them, and just trying to talk their way through it.
Great. Yeah, no, it's really quite fascinating to think about that process, but also the challenges of conveying that in the translation. I know that we have a few questions that have come in from the audience, and so I want to make sure to leave time for us to take those questions. Lisa, I'll throw it back over to you, who's been fielding questions that have come in through the Q&A, please.
Like the tennis open, I grab that ball and toss it to the next. Did Asch write this play before or after the failed Russian Revolution?
Well, around the same time, I know that I translated a memoir about the Russian Revolution just around the end of the first failed Russian Revolution. Yeah.
Okay. And before I go any further, there have been a lot of questions about how people can listen to this play, and you will find it by visiting yiddishbookcenter.org, and it's on the homepage. There's a link. Thanks to Eva for just posting the link on the homepage a few minutes ago. So you'll find it there again, yiddishbookcenter.org, and you can also listen to The Dead Man if you search for that, Caraid's other radio drama. Question to follow up on Daniel's comments a few minutes ago. Related, do you think that this is in any way autobiographical?
Yes, definitely, in terms of it's about Asch trying to figure out what he believes and that he believes it's all these different ways. And he's writing in Yiddish, and one of his most beautiful characters is the Yiddishist. And I think that Reb Chonin, the patriarch, is very much similar to how Asch wrote about his own father, who was very religious, but he would give charity to both the poor Christian neighbors as well as to the poor Jewish neighbors. And in other words, he was always trying to connect to the humanity in people. And you can see Reb Chonin, even though he thinks he doesn't understand why his grandchildren need to have a new Messiah, he's trying to understand it, and he's trying to leave some space open that maybe they're right. It's a new world, and they have to live and adapt.
It seems as if there are numerous novels and plays which slow the interaction between slow the interaction between, not show, family members of different philosophies. Most recently, Tom Stoppard's Leopoldstadt. Is this a literary conceit, or were most middle-class European pre-Holocaust Jewish families like this? That's a question any one of you could field, or all of you.
Well, I'll pass the answer to that.
I mean, I feel like we're all like that all the time. I feel like that's human nature, personally, and also very Jewish. But yeah.
And I guess I would say, even if it doesn't always come out as explicitly as it does in a play like this, it's there, and under the surface or above the surface to different degrees.
And
I will.
I'll just add, I mean, this is, it clearly works very well in a play like this, but it's also sort of a very effective, I think, literary device, right? Because the sort of intergenerational conflict between sort of tradition and the way things have always been, and progress and the future, right? Like, this is sort of a timeless device that works in literature. But also, Caraid, I didn't mention this now, but maybe in a previous conversation, I mean, I'm reading this and I'm seeing sort of Sholem Aleichem's Tevye character, who is also very much kind of dealing with this conflict between tradition and the way things have, his idea of the way things have always been, and then these daughters who are introducing all these changes. Like, it just works so well in terms of, and his stories are being created right around the same time, in terms of this sense of feeling like you're living in a time of change. There's a very conservative traditional mindset, perhaps, versus the progressive, future-oriented next generation. I mean, I was actually, and I know we have other questions, but your point about the generation in between, that in some ways feels like the most stuck, I thought that was quite compelling in this drama, because by making it a 3-generational drama instead of a 2-generational drama, it doesn't turn it into kind of an either or situation, right? There's sort of the traditional mind, but they're also on the move. There's the medium generation in the middle, the parental bourgeois generation, that's really the one that seems stuck. And then there are the kids who are like, no, the world is open before us. We just have to decide which way we're going to go. And it does sort of capture something, I think, very deep and profound. Clearly a common recurring theme in Jewish literature that goes all the way back to the time of the Torah, right? Like, this sort of intergenerational conflict, but also one that I think is probably more universal too.
And I'd also like to say that the structure of the play is very Chekhovian, or maybe just very Russian. A long hello, everybody has tea and talks to one another, and then a long goodbye. So you see that in a lot of people always talking about the Chekhovian goodbyes. When the characters leave, it takes forever.
And sometimes that happens in real life, Caraid. Are you translating Asch's work in any way chronologically? And how does this play fit alongside others you've translated?
I love this play. This may be the play that I love the most, because Chekhov's The Seagull is a play that I love the most because it's his first play. I wrote a version of The Seagull that was set in an Irish American community. So it's just, I'm 25 years into all of this. What should I be? Am I an artist? What do I believe in? Is something I wake up and ask myself every day. So it's just so close to my heart. And I'm not translating chronologically. So I'm just translating what seems like the right thing and what seems exciting and what grasps or speaks to me at the moment. The first two, the reason why I translated Matka Ganef, Matka Thief, after God of Vengeance, because some of the same characters exist in the both plays. And then I did The Dead Man because it was related to this underworld theme of the world of the dead and the world of the criminals and prostitutes. And then the 4 plays that I translated after were part of a collection that Asch published called Nationale Dramen. And I translated that as Plays of My People.
There's a question for you, Rachel. Having performed in God of Vengeance and then your work with De Froyen, how do you think, if at all, any of Asch has informed your work or the recent play that you did, De Froyen?
That's such a wonderful question. I mean, I think that all the plays that I've done inform my work to a certain extent because those characters live within me. I feel there was a role that I played in God of Vengeance that, in the most roundabout way, could have affected De Froyen. So it's just. I think it's always enriching, and especially with working with a really wonderful playwright and these wonderful texts, you can't help but carry that with you to the next project. Yeah, thank you.
And curious about the music. How did you decide to add it? What was the process? And how did you work with Zeke Levine?
Oh, this was so much fun. It was, this idea of Andre at the crossroads that made me think of Bob Dylan. And also Andre's lines are so poetic. I don't know where I've been. I don't know where I'm going. My mother's a stranger to me. My father's a stranger to me. I'm a gravestone on the crossroads of the diaspora, of the Jew from olden times. I mean, this is so poetic that when Zeke and I were recording it and he just started to sing them, and I'm like, yes, that's it. And then I had Zeke and I were in the same translation fellowship in 2019, and we followed each other on Facebook, and I saw the great songs that he was writing. And as this idea of Andre came to me as a prototype Bob Dylan, I knew that Zeke would be perfect, and Zeke was perfect to play the character and also I should say we should have a conversation with him sometime, because he's writing his PhD, finishing up at NYU, about the relationship between Yiddish folk music and American folk music. And what I asked him to do was to take the themes from the play and create songs that showed that relationship musically, and which he did so beautifully.
Also, we'll give a big shout out to you, Zeke, and Michal, all alums of various and sundry Yiddish Book Center programs. And I think it speaks to what you've all brought to today's presentation, which is that the continuing evolution, the continuing exploration of all aspects of Yiddish culture, and from a lot of different perspectives. So I'm going to end with that question, I think, unless Avi, you have one more you want to pose. You're good?
I think it's been a very, very rich discussion, and thank you for inviting to moderate, and thank you to all the panelists. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you all. Really great stuff. Again, for everybody out there, yiddishbookcenter.org homepage, scroll down and you'll get a link to listen to the radio drama. I also want to let you know that Caraid O'Brien's Sholem Asch Underground Trilogy, published by the Yiddish Book Center's imprint, White Goat Press, is available through shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and at bookstores everywhere. It's the first in what we hope to be our playwright series, because there's so much work being done bringing Yiddish work in translation to new audiences, and this is a beginning for that. So Daniel, thank you for everything you brought to today's program. Rachel as well. Caraid for everything, and Avi for joining us as the moderator. I think this was a wonderful way to combine all of these different aspects in a conversation. So thank you again. I also want to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, for all that she brings to this. If you would like to see a full schedule of upcoming events, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. Thanks again to you all, and look forward to bringing you back for your next ventures. Take care.